Liam only meant to bring Grace, a single mother he had quietly grown fond of, to a family dinner so his parents would see for themselves that she wanted nothing from him. He never expected the evening to end with his father frozen in place, a crystal glass slipping from his fingers and shattering across the floor. Joseph Carter was not looking at his son. He was staring at the small silver necklace resting against Grace's collarbone, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way none of them had ever heard. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Grace answered simply that it was the only thing her father had left her before he died. Joseph's face drained of color, and within minutes the quiet family dinner had become something else entirely. If Joseph's secret has already caught your attention, stay until the end to find out exactly what Grace chooses to keep and what she chooses to let go. The story actually begins 6 weeks earlier, long before anyone sat down at that table. Grace Madison was in the middle of a logistics crisis at the medical equipment company where she worked as operations manager, trying to redirect a shipment of critical hospital machines that had been sent to the wrong facility. Liam Carter happened to be there that afternoon, since his firm was quietly evaluating an investment in the distribution partner's supply chain. Grace had no idea who he was. She barely looked up from her phone as she rattled off tracking numbers to a warehouse supervisor, and when Liam offered to help her reach the right department directly, he introduced himself only by his first name, nothing more. What struck him most was that Grace never once tried to impress the men in expensive suits circling the room. Her only concern was getting the machines to the hospital before morning rounds, and that single-mindedness stayed with him long after the crisis was resolved. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who adjusted their posture the moment they realized who was standing beside them, and Grace had done nothing of the sort, too consumed by the shipment problem to notice or care. She spoke to the warehouse supervisor with the same directness she used with the executives observing from the mezzanine above. No deference, no performance, only the plain urgency of getting the job done correctly. By the time the crisis resolved itself 2 hours later, most of the visiting investors had already left for their cars, but Liam lingered near the loading dock, watching Grace close out the paperwork with the same quiet efficiency she had shown from the start. She thanked the warehouse crew individually before she left, calling several of them by name, and Liam found himself oddly moved by something as small as that. It was not the kind of detail most people noticed, and it was exactly the kind of detail that told him everything he needed to know about who she was underneath the composed exterior she carried into every room. They crossed paths again days later at a small coffee shop near the office district, and Liam realized quickly that Grace still believed him to be an ordinary director at some mid-sized firm. He never lied to her outright, but he also never corrected the assumption, telling himself it was simply easier this way, at least for now. Grace, for her part, said very little about her own life, mentioning only that she was raising her child alone and that stability had taken her years of hard work to build. Her son was referenced only in passing, a quiet presence in the background of her world rather than a character in the unfolding drama. Liam found himself drawn to her restraint, the way she measured her words as carefully as she measured her time. It was during one of these meetings that Liam noticed the necklace, a worn silver pendant that looked entirely out of place against her polished, modern wardrobe. When he finally asked about it, Grace only smiled and told him it was the last thing she had left of her father. She did not explain further, and Liam did not push, though something about the way she touched it when she spoke made him understand it mattered more than she was willing to say. Neither of them could have known that this small, tarnished piece of silver would soon bring an entire family's history crashing to the surface. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew longer and less guarded, though Grace never fully lowered the walls she had spent years building around herself. She told him once, almost in passing, that raising a child alone in a city as expensive as Chicago had taught her to trust very little that came too easily, and that included men who seemed too comfortable, too polished, too certain of themselves. Liam found himself choosing his words more carefully after that, aware that every casual comment about his work or his family carried more weight with her than he had intended. He liked that she made him think before he spoke. Most people in his world had long since stopped expecting him to explain himself at all. Grace, for her part, began to notice things about Liam that did not fit the picture she had built of an ordinary corporate director. He never once complained about traffic or long meetings the way most men in his supposed position did, and he never seemed anxious about money in the small, telling ways that people who worried about it often were. She told herself these were simply signs of a disciplined, private man, and she chose not to examine the inconsistency too closely, not yet ready to admit how much she had come to enjoy his company. In the weeks that followed, Liam and Grace saw each other more often, and Grace found herself drawn to his calm, unhurried way of listening, even as she kept a careful distance between them. She had watched money corrode relationships before, watched people become transactions the moment wealth entered the picture, and she had promised herself she would never again build her life around a man's bank account. Then, one evening, she came across a business magazine profile with Liam's photograph beside a headline about Carter Meridian Group, and the article made it clear exactly whose son he was. Grace was not angry that he was wealthy. She was angry that he had let her believe something false for weeks, that he had allowed her to misjudge the shape of his life entirely. When she confronted him, Liam admitted that he had grown so used to people changing the moment they learned his last name that hiding it had become second nature to him. Grace told him plainly that concealing the truth to test someone's intentions was its own quiet form of distrust, no better than the gold digging he claimed to fear. She told him that every conversation they had shared over the past weeks now felt slightly different in hindsight, colored by a piece of information he had chosen to withhold, and that even small omissions had a way of curdling trust long after the fact once they came to light. Liam did not argue the point or try to defend himself further. He simply apologized without excuses, admitting that hiding behind his name had become such an old habit that he rarely stopped to consider how it affected the people standing on the other side of it. Something about the directness of that apology, the complete absence of any attempt to justify himself, convinced Grace to give him one more chance rather than walking away for good. A week later, Liam invited her to a private dinner with his parents, and Grace refused almost before he finished the sentence. She had no interest in becoming the ordinary woman paraded through a billionaire's mansion for scrutiny and quiet judgment, another face to be measured and found wanting. Liam told her he was not asking so his father could approve of her, that approval had never been the point of any of it. He said he was asking because he no longer wanted to keep the two halves of his life sealed off from each other, pretending one did not touch the other. Grace finally agreed, though she had no idea that the house she was about to enter held a history tangled directly with her father's. Saturday evening arrived, and Grace drove out to the Carter estate along the edge of Lake Michigan, half expecting a spectacle of wealth that never came. There was no procession of cars, no staff lined up at the entrance, only Liam himself waiting at the door to greet her. She had rehearsed a dozen versions of this evening in her head on the drive over, imagining cold marble floors and colder conversation, and instead found a house that felt lived in, warm light spilling from tall windows overlooking the dark water beyond the terrace. Eleanor Carter received her warmly, studying her with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent decades watching people approach her son, and she recognized almost immediately that Grace was not like the others who had come before her. There was no darting glance around the room to assess its value, no careful positioning near Liam meant to signal ownership. Eleanor found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did with her son's guests, offering Grace a glass of wine and asking genuine questions about her work rather than the usual polite interrogation reserved for newcomers to the family circle. Joseph appeared last, still mid-conversation with Liam when Grace stepped into the dining room, and it was in that instant that everything in the house seemed to stop. He had been mid-sentence, something about a quarterly report, and the words simply died in his throat as his eyes landed on her. Joseph's eyes fixed on the necklace at Grace's throat, a small tarnished compass pendant that had clearly been worn for years. The glass in his hand tilted, then slipped, shattering against the hardwood floor before anyone could react. Eleanor had never once seen her husband lose composure like this in nearly 40 years of marriage. "Where did you get that?" Joseph asked again, and Grace, startled, answered that it had belonged to her father. When Joseph asked for the man's name, Grace told him it was Samuel Madison, and for a long moment Joseph could not produce a single word in response. He eventually sat back down at the table, though he barely touched his food, his eyes returning again and again to Grace as though he were trying to reconcile her face with a memory buried decades deep. Liam grew visibly uneasy watching his father unravel in real time, something he had never witnessed in all his years. Grace, unaware of the storm she had walked into, mentioned that her father had been a mechanical engineer who died in an industrial accident when she was young. Joseph's hand tightened around the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Grace continued, explaining that her family had been told Samuel made a critical error before the accident occurred, an error that destroyed his professional reputation posthumously and left her mother struggling under years of financial hardship. Joseph rose from his chair so abruptly it nearly toppled backward, and without another word he walked out of the room. Before he disappeared down the hallway, he turned back once and looked directly at Grace, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father did not cause that accident," he said. The room fell into a silence so complete that Grace could hear her own pulse in her ears. She stood immediately, her composure cracking for the first time that evening, and Liam turned to look at his father's retreating figure with a question forming that he was almost afraid to ask. If Joseph had known all along that Samuel was innocent, why had he never said a single word in 3 decades? Liam followed his father down the hall and into his private study, leaving Grace behind in the dining room, though she made a move to leave entirely until Eleanor gently stopped her. If Joseph knew something connected to her father's death, Eleanor said quietly, then Grace had every right to hear it for herself. Together they joined the 2 men in the study, where Joseph stood before an old safe hidden behind a wall of bookshelves, his hands trembling as he worked the combination. When it finally opened, there was no money inside, only a thick folder of company records dated more than 30 years earlier, yellowed and brittle with age. Carter Meridian, Joseph explained, had been nothing more than a small engineering firm back then, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy with every contract they signed. Samuel Madison had been the chief engineer, brilliant and meticulous, while Joseph handled the business side of the operation. The 2 men had been close friends in those days, closer than brothers by some accounts, building the company together from almost nothing. Samuel had designed a new safety system for one of their production lines and discovered that equipment at a client's factory was at serious risk of catastrophic overload. He demanded the line be shut down immediately, no exceptions, no delays. But shutting the factory down meant losing Carter Meridian's largest contract, the one deal keeping the company from collapsing entirely. Joseph did not cause the accident with his own hands, but he pressured Samuel to delay the shutdown for 48 hours, just long enough to complete one final critical order. Samuel refused to let it go quietly and filed a written report outlining the danger in explicit terms. Joseph received that report personally, and instead of acting on it, he filed it away in a drawer and said nothing to anyone. The following night, the system failed catastrophically, and Samuel rushed back into the technical area to help with the evacuation, where he lost his life trying to save the very workers Joseph had refused to protect. In the aftermath, the company's attorneys warned Joseph that if Samuel's original report ever surfaced, Carter Meridian could face bankruptcy, and Joseph himself could be held personally liable for what had happened. Terrified of losing everything he had built, Joseph allowed the insurance investigators to conclude that Samuel had failed to follow proper safety procedures before the accident occurred. Joseph never wrote the accusation himself, and he told himself for years that this distinction mattered somehow. But he also never stepped forward to stop the lie from spreading, never corrected the record when it would have cost him everything to do so. That silence, more than any single decision, had been the guilt he carried quietly for 32 years. He remembered standing at Samuel's funeral, watching Grace's mother clutch a folded flag she had not even been entitled to, watching her accept condolences from men who whispered afterward about negligence and carelessness, men who had no idea the truth sat locked in a drawer in Joseph's office less than 2 miles away. He told himself at the time that speaking up would accomplish nothing, that Samuel was already gone and nothing could bring him back, that the only practical outcome of confession would be the collapse of the company that now employed hundreds of families who had nothing to do with what happened. It was a convenient argument, and Joseph had repeated it to himself so many times over the years that he had almost come to believe it. Almost. Every promotion he approved in Samuel's absence, every ribbon-cutting ceremony, every anniversary celebration of the company's founding carried the quiet weight of that unspoken lie sitting beneath it. He built an entire empire on the foundation of a friend's unfinished sentence, and he had never once found the courage to go back and finish it himself. Grace did not cry when she heard it. Her stillness made the moment heavier than any tears could have. She only asked, in a voice stripped of all emotion, whether Joseph had known her father was innocent for all these years. Joseph answered with a single word, yes, unable to look at her directly as he said it. Grace asked her final question just as plainly, whether he had allowed her mother to believe her husband died in disgrace rather than admit the truth. Joseph had no defense left to offer, and Liam, watching his father in that moment, realized he no longer recognized the man he had spent his entire life respecting. Joseph told them he had thought about finding Samuel's family many times over the years, but he had never found the courage to face what he had done. He offered Grace a financial settlement instead, a sum large enough to change the course of her life completely. Grace refused before he had even finished explaining the terms. She had not walked into this house looking for money, and only hours earlier she had not even known that Joseph Carter had ever crossed paths with her father at all. If Joseph truly wanted to make this right, Grace told him, then he needed to do something no amount of money could ever accomplish. He needed to restore Samuel Madison's name in full. He needed to release the original report to the public, correct the company's official records, and personally inform everyone who had been affected that Samuel had been right all along, that his warning had been ignored for the sake of a single contract. Joseph warned that doing so could unravel the entire legacy he had spent his life constructing. Grace answered without hesitation that a legacy built on a lie was never worth being proud of in the first place, no matter how large it grew. She told him she had spent her whole childhood watching her mother apologize for a husband who had done nothing wrong, watching relatives quietly distance themselves from the family at gatherings, watching her mother's own name become tangled up in a shame that was never hers to carry. Money could not undo any of that, she said, and she refused to let a settlement become a quiet way of purchasing her silence, the same way silence itself had once been purchased from the insurance investigators 3 decades earlier. If Joseph wanted absolution, he would have to earn it the same way her father had tried to earn safety for people he had never even met, by telling the truth regardless of what it cost him. She gathered her coat and walked toward the door, and Liam moved to follow her out, but Grace stopped him with a single look. This was a matter between Liam and his family now, she said, not something she wanted to draw him into further. She did not want him turning against his own father simply to prove something to her. Not tonight, not like this. Liam stood at the window and watched her car disappear past the gates, the taillights fading into the dark tree line. Behind him, Joseph spoke quietly, telling him that he had no idea what exposing this could destroy. Liam turned to face his father fully for the first time since dinner began. No, he agreed, he did not know what it would destroy, but he knew exactly what continuing to hide it would turn them both into. The following morning, Liam requested an independent legal review of the old company records, bypassing his father's usual channels entirely. Joseph was furious, and the confrontation that followed was the most severe the two men had experienced in years, voices raised in a house that had always prided itself on composure. Joseph argued that thousands of employees now depended on Carter Meridian's stability, and that dragging up a 32-year-old tragedy could put all of their livelihoods at risk. Liam did not deny the potential consequences, but he refused to let the welfare of current employees become an excuse for continuing a decades-old cover-up. Some truths, he said, could not keep being postponed simply because the timing was inconvenient. Joseph accused his son of being naive, of treating a complicated business decision made under desperate circumstances as though it were a simple matter of right and wrong. Liam reminded him quietly that a man had died, and that his family had spent 3 decades believing he was responsible for his own death. There was no version of that story complicated enough to make the silence forgivable, he said. No boardroom pressure or bankruptcy risk significant enough to justify allowing a dead man's name to rot in disgrace while the truth sat locked in a drawer 2 floors above them. Joseph had no answer for that, and for the first time in the argument he simply stopped talking. Eleanor watched the exchange from the doorway without intervening, though later that night she told Joseph privately that she had always sensed something unresolved sitting beneath the surface of him, some old weight he carried into every room without ever naming it. She did not ask for details. She only told him that whatever it was clearly time to let it go, one way or another, before it broke something inside their family that could not be repaired. During the review, the legal team uncovered something even Joseph had not known. Samuel had kept a backup copy of his final safety report before he died, one that had never made it into the company's files. After his death, a portion of his personal documents had been shipped back to his family, only for it to be lost somewhere during one of Grace's mother's many moves in the years that followed. The compass pendant Grace had worn her entire adult life, it turned out, contained a small hidden compartment along its back edge that she had never managed to open. Inside was a tiny key belonging to a storage unit Samuel had rented shortly before the accident occurred. It finally explained why Joseph had recognized the necklace the instant he saw it. He was the one who had given it to Samuel decades earlier, back when the two of them founded the company together in a rented garage with nothing but ambition and borrowed money. The facility itself had changed ownership twice over the decades, and it took Liam's legal team the better part of a day just to confirm the unit had never been emptied or reassigned, sitting untouched under an old maintenance agreement that had simply never lapsed. Grace stood outside the rolling metal door for a long moment before she could bring herself to lift it, aware that whatever waited inside had been sealed away since before she was old enough to remember her father's face clearly. Liam stood beside her without speaking, letting her set the pace of a moment that belonged entirely to her. Grace and Liam tracked down the storage facility using the old records still attached to the account, and inside they found the remaining documents Samuel had left behind before his death. Among them was a complete copy of the safety report, dated clearly, along with a private letter Samuel had written to Joseph that had apparently never been delivered. Samuel had not written the letter to accuse his friend of anything. He had written only a warning, calm and measured even in the face of what he clearly feared was coming. If Joseph ever placed the value of a contract above the safety of the people working beneath him, Samuel wrote, then the company they had built together would no longer be one he wanted any part of. Joseph read those words for the first time in 32 years, sitting alone in his study long after everyone else had gone home, the letter shaking slightly in his hands under the single lamp still burning on his desk. He read it 3 times before he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what his silence had cost. Not just Samuel, and not just Grace and her mother, but the version of himself he might have become had he chosen honesty over survival all those years ago. It was the first time in living memory that anyone in his family had seen him weep. Joseph called an emergency meeting of the full board without warning anyone beforehand, and Liam assumed his father intended to fight the release of the documents to the very end. Instead, Joseph placed Samuel's original report directly on the table in front of every executive in the room. He announced his decision to make the entire history public, holding nothing back. He did not blame the attorneys who had shaped the original cover story 3 decades earlier. He did not blame the financial pressure the company had faced at the time, or point to his own youth and inexperience as an excuse for what he had allowed to happen. Joseph accepted full responsibility for the silence he alone had chosen to maintain for 32 years. In the weeks that followed, Carter Meridian formally corrected its historical records for the first time since the accident occurred. Samuel Madison was publicly recognized as the engineer who had identified the danger and tried desperately to prevent the disaster that ultimately claimed his life. The company established a safety initiative bearing his name, though Grace insisted it be overseen by an independent board, so it could never be reduced to a simple public relations exercise designed to repair the family's image. Joseph agreed to every condition she set without argument. Several of the retired engineers who had worked alongside Samuel decades earlier reached out to Grace directly once the news became public, sharing memories she had never heard before, stories of a man who checked every measurement twice and never once cut a corner even when deadlines pressed hardest against him. One elderly man wept on the phone with her, saying he had always suspected the official story was incomplete, but had been too afraid of losing his own job to ever say so aloud. Grace kept every one of those conversations, writing them down in a notebook she began keeping specifically for her father, filling in decades of silence one memory at a time. Grace, for her part, still refused to accept the personal financial settlement Joseph continued to offer her, no matter how many times he brought it up. Joseph came to see her alone one afternoon, without Liam by his side for the first time since they had met. He told her plainly that he did not expect forgiveness, and that he had not come looking for it. He only wanted her to know, in his own words, that her father had been a far better man than he had ever managed to be. Grace answered that forgiveness could not simply appear because the truth had finally been spoken aloud after so many years of silence. But she admitted quietly that Joseph's decision to speak it at all still meant something to her, even if it changed nothing about what had already been lost. Joseph asked her, almost hesitantly, what her mother had been like in the years after Samuel died, and Grace found herself telling him things she had not spoken aloud in a long time. About the nights her mother worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment. About the neighbors who whispered when they thought Grace could not hear them. About growing up believing her father's name was something to be quietly ashamed of rather than proud of. Joseph listened without interrupting, his hands folded tightly in his lap, absorbing every detail like a man finally facing a debt he had spent decades avoiding. When Grace finished, he told her simply that he was sorry, not as an excuse or an explanation, but as the plain truth of a man who understood, at last, the full weight of what his silence had cost. It was not a perfect reconciliation, not the kind found in stories built for easy endings. It was only ever meant to be the first step of a much longer process of making things right. Several months passed before Carter Meridian finally emerged from the investigation that followed, though not without considerable financial and reputational damage along the way. Joseph stepped down from his executive role shortly afterward, choosing to remain only as a quiet advisor to the board he had once controlled outright. Liam restructured the company's entire safety oversight system, along with a formal internal whistleblower program designed to ensure no engineer would ever again be silenced, the way Samuel had been decades earlier, complete with protections that made it impossible for a single executive to bury a warning the way his father once had. More importantly to Grace, Liam never once used his position or his family's influence to pressure her back into a relationship she was not ready to resume. He simply gave her the time and space she needed, without conditions attached. Slowly, carefully, the two of them began rebuilding what they had, this time without any secrets standing between them. One afternoon, an envelope arrived at Grace's apartment, addressed in handwriting she did not immediately recognize. It had not come from Liam. It had come from Joseph himself, inviting her to dinner once again, though this time the terms were entirely different from before. There would be no board members present, no press waiting outside, no attorneys hovering nearby to manage the optics of the evening. It would simply be a family dinner. Nothing more and nothing less than that. Grace sat with the letter for a long time before finally deciding to accept his invitation. She walked into the very same dining room where Joseph had once frozen in place at the sight of her necklace, and once again he rose to his feet the moment she entered. This time, however, his eyes were not fixed on the pendant at her throat. He looked directly at her instead, steady and unflinching in a way he had never quite managed during their first encounter. On the table in front of him sat a small wooden box, unremarkable except for its careful placement at the center of the table. Inside was an old photograph of Joseph and Samuel as young men, standing proudly in front of the very first workshop where Carter Meridian had begun. Written across the back in Samuel's own handwriting were the words, "Build something worth being proud of." Joseph placed the photograph gently into Grace's hands and told her it belonged to her family now, not to his. After dinner, Liam walked with Grace out onto the terrace overlooking the dark water of the lake. He did not drop to one knee in some sudden theatrical gesture, and he made no attempt to manufacture a fairy tale ending that neither of them had earned. He simply asked her whether she still wanted to build a future together with him, after everything that had happened between their two families. Grace stood quietly for a moment, letting the cool evening air settle around them before she answered. She told him she had spent most of her life believing that trusting someone completely was a kind of weakness, a door left open for other people to walk through and take whatever they wanted before disappearing. Watching Liam choose the harder, costlier truth over his own family's comfort had changed something in that belief, slowly and without her fully realizing it until this exact moment. She was not naive enough to think the road ahead would be simple, not with a family history as complicated as theirs now was, but she no longer felt the need to keep one foot out the door in case it all fell apart. Grace glanced back through the glass doors at Joseph and Eleanor, quietly clearing plates from the table together like any ordinary couple at the end of an ordinary evening. The house that had once made her feel like an outsider, the moment she stepped through its doors, had slowly become the place where the truth was finally allowed to stand in the open. Grace took Liam's hand and told him yes. It was not because he was wealthy, and it was never about anything his family's fortune could offer her in exchange for her silence or her forgiveness. It was because when Liam had been forced to choose between protecting his family's power and protecting the truth, he had chosen the truth without hesitation and without looking back, and that, more than any inheritance or any name, was the only thing that had ever truly mattered to her.